Okay, what I'm going to do in this lecture is I'm going to tell you about what a carbon model has to do, and I'm going to talk about types of carbon models, and I'm going to talk about the ways in which you can interface data to models and with concepts and examples. Now, yesterday Amos talked about a quite tight structure where you have data, you have some data, you have a model. They're both sorts of information, and you combine them in a single mathematical entity, so your model and your data co-evolve with each other. I've got what I'm going to talk about is a looser sort of interaction, but essentially contains within my lecture what Amos is doing, but not at all within that strict mathematical structure he's using. Okay, now this course is about the system. Now, if you're going to talk about a system, you've got to use models. You've no option. And the reason being is that a system, to understand how a system works, you've got to combine a lot of things, a lot of types of information or knowledge into your calculations of something. And the model finally is a way of just coming up with a number or a set of numbers from a set of information. So you need to be able to combine observations with what you understand about the processes going on. Really important for models is you can talk about interconnection of processes. So you don't have to worry about photosynthesis on its own or soil moisture on its own. You have to worry about how they're going to relate to each other and how they affect each other. And so the model allows you to do that. And as you saw yesterday, there are many, many processes which go into the carbon cycle, and you have to get them all into the description to get the calculation right. You also want something that can give you some idea about how sensitive your calculations are and what things do you not know. If you're trying to calculate a carbon flux, but there's something you've not measured, but you've got to put it in your model. You've got to. So therefore, putting something in that you don't know very well means you've got to effectively quantify your own ignorance. You've got to put a parameter in or something, or a distribution, a probability distribution. So within the model, at least when it starts, you've got a description of your own, what you don't know. Unfortunately, what happens is that 20 years later, when someone else is using the same model, they've completely forgotten about those bits in the model that you didn't know about and just use them as though they're truth. And in fact, many models still contain a measurement that was taken 35 years ago in the middle of Scotland, and that's their parameter that drives a particular process. So there's a lot of fossil, in fact, redundant and wrong information embedded in the very big models, because many of these models have become quite big and cumbersome. And the other thing you want to do with a model is make some sort of prediction, because you want to know a little bit about the future. Now, I think there's various people who have said it, but Niels Bohr said prediction is very difficult, particularly when you're trying to predict the future. And I believe that's also a Danish proverb. So the hardest part is the prediction, and how far ahead you predict things is also an issue with models. But so what I'm going to talk about is mine's a conceptual talk this morning. It's not really about details, I hope. Okay, but overall, in Earth system models, there's been a change in emphasis. Because, if you look at all the calculations done 10 years ago, everyone goes out to 2100. And personally, if someone makes a prediction out to 2100, I don't actually care very much, because first of all, I don't even think that's really science, it's metaphysics. And that in the long term, we're all dead, so you can make whatever prediction you like. No one's going to falsify it. But there is more of a concern these days about regional and decadal prediction, because that's the timescale in which we exist, when societies can respond or change. And this is changing what you want from a model. So there are implications from modeling, because, first of all, for century scale prediction, what you're interested in is asymptotic behavior. You're not that bothered about initial conditions. because they just fade away. As most of you know, if you handle any sort of differential equation, initial conditions, usually the effect fades. And that means your initial conditions are critical. Okay, so if you over the next 10 years, if you don't know where you are now, you haven't got a prayer of knowing where you'll be in 10 years' time, from terms of the Earth's condition, Earth's state. So this changes totally the relationship between the models and data and the needs of models for data. And it makes Earth observation data an essential part of the process. Because if we're talking about large-scale global models, and the only place you're going to get global information, apart from, is Earth observation or some of these dense networks of say, flask measurements, which can, in some cases, if you can do some sort of interpolation, allow you to make a global picture. But many of the things we need, the only place you're going to get global information from is from satellites. Oops, sorry. Now, I'm now going to talk about the role of vegetation and soils in the carbon models. I showed this slide yesterday, but I want to add, I've added a couple of extra terms because we need them. And I need them for the next diagram. There are what are called, there are 3 pools of carbon. One of them is woody biomass. That's both the above ground biomass and the below ground biomass, the woody biomass. Now, the woody biomass of a tree, for example, doesn't do anything. It has no life function, but it does keep the tree upright. It's a structural. It's a way. It contains the vessels by which water is pumped through the plant. It allows and nutrients get up into the plant. But in terms of growth, it doesn't do anything much. Litter is the stuff that falls onto the ground. Soil carbon is all this lot below ground that's where microbes and bacteria start to degrade organic matter. You've got leaves, obviously, and you've got fine roots. Now, fine roots are not these things here. Fine roots are the tiny little things on the edges of those. This is below ground biomass. Fine roots are the equivalent of leaves, but below ground. They're the ones by which the plant scavenges for the things it needs from the soil, like water or phosphorus or nitrogen. And these things are not, they have quite a short lifetime. So think of them as just leaves underground. But they're functional. So leaves and roots are functional. Biomass is there just to keep this tree or this plant where it is, stood up and not falling over. Okay, so those are the terms I want to use. Now, if we're going to talk about any carbon model and flows through any carbon model, it looks something like this. If you're going to construct any model for the terrestrial case, I'm not going to talk about the oceans because I'm not really competent to do it very well, so I'll do it this way. It looks like this. You've got 3 pools. There's the leaves, the roots, that's the fine roots, and you've got the wood, as I've just described. Now, when you photosynthesize, a certain proportion is emitted or is respired. So that's the carbon respired by the plant. What's left over, this is net primary production that's along this channel here. That's what's available to the plant to build itself, to use. And it's got to allocate it. It's got to allocate this carbon to those three pools. So these are the allocation fractions to wood, roots, and foliage. So one decision the plant makes is it's worked to photosynthesize material. Now it's got to decide where to put it. So it's got to make an evolutionary decision, depending on where it is and what the needs are. In a very windy place, it probably put a lot of material into the wood, so it won't get blown over. In places that are more stable, and you can put more effort into where there's little sunlight, you may want to put a lot of effort into foliage. It depends. It's got to make a decision. Now, each one of these pools decays. So this is a loss rate. So these are our loss rates for the different pools. And when they decay, they fall off the plant and they go somewhere. So they go into the litter pool, or they go into the soil organic matter, actually this is normally broken down into, I've got not quite the best diagram here, but there's normally two sorts of litter. There's a coarse woody debris, so if a branch falls off, it lasts a lot longer than if the needles fall off a tree, so this could be decomposed. But then there's this, but then these litter pools decompose and go into the soil. Then these pools on the right also are decomposed by fungi and by bacteria and so on. And they respire. So this is a heterotrophic respiration. Now, the carbon balance of that system, this is what comes in, is GPP, and what goes out are these two respirations. And the difference between them is whether that's a carbon source or a carbon sink. If there's more GPP than respiration, it's a carbon sink. If there's less GPP than respiration, it's a carbon source. So no matter how you build your model, it contains that. Except for most models, you'd never find this because it's buried deep within the machinery. Wherever there is a particular model, which I'll refer to probably called Dalek, which is data assimilation, land, I forgot what the E and C stand for, but it's one that's developed by Matt Williams in Edinburgh. Okay, but this is a completely generic model. But we're going to find you can make some very strong inferences from that model later on. Now, this is looking much more like the sort of models you get in an Earth system model. And what we've got here is that you've got, this is the vegetation component here. So this is the biophysics. This is all the photosynthesis and soil activity that's taking on here. This can be very fast. And in this box here, you've got it's not quite a population, but it's what the whole system's doing. So these can be quite slow things. So there's disturbance factors in fire. There's trees fall over or wheat falls over. If there's human interaction in a plantation, you may thin the forest, for example, and you get other sorts of disturbance through insects and so on. So on this side, you've got biomass also. Now, then you've got parts which come in from the atmosphere and photosynthesis, and parts which go out from these. These are the respiration terms, and this is the photosynthesis term. And as my previous diagram said, this is jet gross primary production, net primary production. When you do all the balance, you get net biome production, which is the crucial system term because that's whether it's a carbon source or sink. I've also got here leach because some soil goes out into water. Some of the soil carbon goes into water and goes actually to the ocean system eventually. So that's much more like what you get in an Earth system model, except this is just a carbon model. You really need a carbon and water model because plants need vegetation. You can't do carbon without water. And this is just the same diagram, but now with some of the water variables in there. And it's got flows to and from the atmosphere, and the blue ones are water. This is evapotranspiration. The brown ones, or reddy brown ones, are carbon. And marked on it are some of the processes that you need to put in your model to capture those water and carbon flows. And the ones in red I've marked because they are what are called essential climate variables as recognized by the Global Climate Observing System, and hence the IPCC. Okay, so each one of those are ones that we try and measure, and various ones of these fall under the ESA Climate Change Initiative. So permafrost is a new one. Biomass is a new one. Well, no, that's been there for a while. Fire's been there for a while, etc. Okay, some of them have been there for a while, but you get the picture. Okay. Now, that still isn't an Earth system model, land surface model, because what's missing from that is energy. Now, I'm not going to do the energy one, but energy transfers between the land surface and the atmosphere are crucial in driving the system. So you need to soup it up still further to get what you embed in an Earth system model. So I'm going to go no further than this, and I'm really going to deal really just with the carbon part. Now, the Earth system model, carbon flux models, were developed mainly to investigate the response of the land and ocean to climate change, so what would happen in the very long term. They were intended to be predictive. Okay, so they want to predict out to 2100 was to say that's typically what they did. Now let's think about what does that mean. If I want a model to predict what's going to happen in 2100, I've no data. I've no data in 2100, so how can I make it work? Well, the only way I can make it work is to make every single process in there parameterized. So I actually calculate it internally, okay? So going back to this, or even this, every process in there has to be recoverable from, if I just know about what the climate's doing, I need to be able to predict what fire will do in 2100 or 2050. I need to know how soil moisture will behave. I need to know how my snowpack will build up in the north in winter. So what that means is for the models which are in an Earth system model, they're parameterized, they're not driven. And so if you want to get the model right, or even get even close to right, you've got to be able to measure those parameters or estimate them or put them in somewhere. This is completely different from what Amos was talking about yesterday, where basically you're assimilating data on the fly and you're changing the state of the system. Here you've got to find out about what's making the model work, because otherwise you don't have a predictive model. It's very important you understand this distinction between driven and predictive models. They have quite different requirements for what you need to know to make them work. They were designed for a data-poor environment. Many of these models were I mean, my colleague in Sheffield in Woodward was one of the very first people to produce a dynamic vegetation model, and his view then was that he just wanted to know what would be the change in populations over the 21st century as climate warmed and as carbon dioxide became increased. He just wanted to get he wanted to know what the trends were. And of course, this is going back to probably 1970s, 1980s. There weren't the satellites in orbit. And so basically, he was operating in a very data-poor environment. So the whole model is designed to operate almost without data. But the world isn't, we're in a completely different situation now. Oh, and by the way, just let me say a little bit more about that. Most of the models are based on the same sort of structure, where they don't interact with data at all if they can avoid it. They prefer to just be models. And amongst modelers, there has been a resistance to really try and use data. But we're in a different world now because we've got terabytes of data. We've got too much data in many cases. We don't know how to use some of the data. But the models we're using in many cases are simply not designed for that world. So I personally think there's a major effort needs to be made to rethink how we're doing some of these models. Something that is worth saying here, because I'm not going to say much more about it, but the land models were originally sort of completely driven by that. So you have a climate, it drives a carbon model, and the carbon model does what it does, and that's it. It doesn't feed back. But in the last, probably 15 years, is it? Yeah, 15 years, these land carbon models have been properly embedded in a coupled way into full ESMs, so you can do the full climate carbon cycle feedback, which has an effect, a very significant effect. It has about a degree of effect, a degree of warming effect. Now, sorry, to flick backwards and forwards, but these were, let me stress that word, flux. These models were designed to get the flux right, because what you're thinking about is, well, how much loading do I put into, how much carbon dioxide loading do I put into the atmosphere? How much do I take out of it? So they didn't worry too much about the inner workings or the pools, because as long as they got this net ecosystem exchange or net biome productivity right, they were good enough for the climate question, or so it seems. Now, how well do these models do? And do they need only to worry about fluxes? That plot on the left in there is from something called the C4, called what? I know the acronym, it's C5 MIPIP. It's a model into comparison project. I forgot what the C is. Oh, it's coupled model into comparison project. Those are 7, let's call them state-of-the-art, but leading models from various places, from France and from Germany and from the US. And on the left-hand side is the land uptake of carbon in billions of tons of carbon per year. And this is the prediction out to 2100. Now, this is a scandal because, well, the first thing you can see is these models disagree enormously. They sort of agree round about now, which if they didn't agree round about now, you should junk them anyway, because they can't even get the present right. Okay, but if you look at this one, this is the one that launched many of these studies. This one is the Hadley calculation. It's been updated, but let me point out what happens. This is the carbon uptake by the land. This is negative, and this is positive. You'll see that in 2050, this curve goes negative. Okay, that means the land uptake is negative. That means the land becomes a source, not a sink. So if this were right, then around about 2050, the wouldn't be in a land sink anymore. The land wouldn't be helping us to mitigate fossil fuels. It would actually be acting in the other direction and putting carbon into the atmosphere. And that's being driven because of in the model by the response of the soils to rising temperature. In the very first day this week, the Q10 was mentioned. If you've got this exponential model for soil respiration, this is inevitable. You can't avoid it because as temperature warms, you'll get an exponential rise in soil respiration, whereas the response of vegetation will be slower than exponential. So at some point they'll cross. In this calculation, it was in 2050. None of the other models do that. Now, which is right? I don't know. Nobody knows. But why I've put that title along the top is because they only worried about fluxes. And so they didn't worry too much about the pools. And the other thing is that the flux of the atmosphere is made up of big fluxes, which are the photosynthesis and the soil respiration. It's the difference between them and a disturbance term. And those are very big numbers and very small numbers. And you can actually get the difference right, but the actual fluxes making them up can both be badly wrong. And in fact, if you look at those models, these constituent fluxes can be quite different. Now, the focus of these models on fluxes, what changed the game a bit was this particular paper by Friend. And the key message is in italics. It says that carbon residence time dominates uncertainty in terrestrial vegetation responses to future climate and atmospheric CO2. Carbon residence time is the amount of time a carbon atom stays within the system. It might be thousands, if it's, and that's true of anywhere. But in vegetation, there'll be clearly a carbon atom will spend less time in a leaf if it's going to fall off and decay in winter, than if it was in the trunk, where it may be there for decades or centuries. Okay, now let's go back to this model and say, well, what does that? If that's true, how do we get at residence time? And I'm going to show you how powerful this model is. So residence time, it comes out really simply from this model. Because if you make this reasonable assumption that the loss from any pool, this loss rate, is proportional to how much is in the pool, then you're forced to the fact. So if you make this assumption that the loss rate is proportional to the size of the pool divided by the residence time, because that's what the residence time would be, then what you find is the size of the pool is just given by tau times p, where p is the mean input into the pool. Any of you could do that calculation with that model. It's a simple first-order differential equation. You could do it, and you can do it in 10 minutes. So that comes straight out of this model. Now, okay, the bottom line to this, I'll not go through the details. The bottom line is that your carbon residence time is given by that bottom equation. It's the biomass, your above-ground biomass, divided by the fraction allocated to the above-ground biomass, divided by the net primary production. So this is a simple way of calculating this crucial quantity for climate change, which is the residence time. So if you can measure biomass, you can measure MPP, and you've got an idea of what the allocation rate is, then you know carbon residence time. Well, you can do it. So, for example, what this is a paper from Martin Thurner, as I was co-author on it, 2017. The middle is what the observed turnover rate. So it's 1 over, this is 1 over the turnover time. And it's showing it's only done for the temperate region because the biomass map on which it's based was only calculated for the Northern Hemisphere. It's used in ENVISAT, very long time series of ENVISAT radar, C-band radar. And this is the modeled version. And this is the difference, the relative difference, which can be up to a factor of 100%, plus or minus. And I think, if I remember right, the model being used is J.S. Bark. It's Max Planck's, it's probably J.S. Bark. Okay, now, I've no time to talk about the details, but where you get discrepancies, first of all, that these are radically different, that's point one. Also, from this thing here, you can explain why you're getting, in these regions, why you're getting differences and changes in turnover time to do with things like drought, frost effects, insect outbreaks, and so on. So there's a lot of information packed into there. By the way, I've used the observed in brackets because I'm going to explain that a little later. It's not really observed. It all comes down to the MPP part, from which is derived from MODIS. Now, well, let's look at some of the other models. I think that was JS Back. Look at some of the other models, which are so if you get biomass wrong, and you're going to get the residence time wrong. If you get the residence time wrong, you get the wrong. You're just going to get the wrong number for what's going to go into the future prediction. How well do the other models do? These are three fairly well-known models. Alcadet is the French one, this is the Sheffield one, and this is the Lund-Potsdam-Jena model. This is latitude along the bottom. This is biomass stocks, tons per hectare. And you'll see, we've gone north to south along this transect through Africa. Well, what you can see straight away, those models do not agree at all about how much biomass there is and where it is and how it's distributed. So okay. These are a bigger collection of models where this is the biomass map. I'll go to the last one. This is the NPP. It's all calculated by the model. And this is the residence time. Now, I personally hate looking at these sort of diagrams where there's sort of 10 things on the screen. I don't know what to look at. So I should look at two things to try and make some sense of this. Red is long residence time. Green is short residence time. First of all, look at the Amazon. Okay? Look how much the variation is in the Amazon. Says the residence time is about 30 years. Here it's down about 15 or so. This is quite long. This is because it's quite short. So there's a huge difference in turnover time estimated by the models. And also look at the difference between the Amazon and the boreal zone. Okay? So in some models, here the lifetime in the tropics is much longer than the boreal zone. In other models, it's the other way around. Which one was it? Like here. Here, it says the residence time in this boreal forest here is longer than the Amazon. So the models are really not agreeing at all about these fundamental internal processes which affect their predictions for the future. So there's a lot of work to be done. Okay, now I'm going to talk about, so that's what you can do with just a simple generic model. You can get really powerful messages without doing almost no mathematics. I mean, we just solve a little differential equation to get that. Now let's look at a more general description of how, suppose we do have a model and you want to interact with it in some way. Well, how can you do this? Well, this is any old model. It doesn't even have to be a carbon model. But what you've got here, I've outlined in green, the sort of things which go into the model. And I'm assuming that we know about climate, we assume we know about other inputs, which might be soil, for example. You've got the state, so the current state of the model, which might be a big, long vector saying it's giving you soil temperature, vegetation type, biomass, whatever. And the model's trying to step forward in time to get the next state. The other thing which goes into the model is parameters which you need to know to make the model work. There are processes which you've got to embed in the model to describe reality in some sense. And you also might want to test the model to see whether it gives the right answers. And if you do test it and you find it didn't give the right answer, you might want to feed that back into the model to change the model in some way. And this is sort of, in a very weak way, this is what Amos is talking about through full-on data assimilation, but I'm using a rather weaker description of it here. Now, when you translate that into what you do with a land model, you can start putting processes or measurements on here. So, So, for example, and for the state one, for example, you might want to put in the land cover or the forest age or biomass or something as your current state. If you're interested in the parameters, you might want to parameterize the parameters which describe the phenology. So when does vegetation switch on in spring? You may want to parameterize how much water how much snow, how much water is turned into snow from precipitation or burnt area. For processes, you might look at the things like absorbed photosynthetic radiation, or SIF if you prefer, or leaf area index, or snow cover, or fire, and so on. Okay, and you may be able to feed these back. One thing I should say here that's important, I put it in the top left there, that when you look at the scale of a carbon model, or a climate model, a carbon model is driven by climate. So the scale of the model is determined by the climate scale, up to a certain point. Now, what is the climate scale? Well, a typical grid cell is something between about 1/4 and 1 degree. That's the best you're going to get is about 1/6 of a degree. So at this sort of latitude, 1/6 of a degree is 10 kilometers by 20 kilometers, roughly speaking. Okay? So the sort of grid cells you're dealing with are pretty large. They're well beyond field size, for example. However, within the models, you might think, well, what's the point in making high-resolution measurements if you're going to drive a carbon model? You can actually use higher-resolution data because the grid cells in these models are typically, they're not painted in one color. They're not just got one sort of land cover. They have a certain proportion of different sorts of land cover, so bare soil or trees or whatever. So you can use higher-resolution information. Okay, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to actually run you through some of these interactions and show you how they might work. Oh, well, by the way, this is a truly awful, I'm really sorry about this. There is another sort of model I want to mention. This is what's called a light use efficiency model. I mentioned light use efficiency, and several people have actually in the last 2 days. But this is what's called the CASA model. It's the Carnegie, Ames, Stanford model. Now, this is not a predictive model. It's a driven model. I looked all over the web for a decent picture for it, and I couldn't find anything good, so I really apologize. But what this model does, it's got a proper carbon model in it, that's here, but it drives it by climate, by NDVI, it's this index about vegetation activity, about vegetation cover, and it also puts in soil texture. And it uses those as drives, and the current version's put in fire, for example. And you use that to just drive the thing, just move on in time. You just use your observations, shove them in the model, and update your calculations. So this shows seasonal variations in carbon balance. Now, when I put the inverted commas and the observed version of the turnover time is because to get the NPP, that was the model that was used. So it was actually a modeled version, but driven by data that gave the NPP. The biomass was directly from observations. This is an example of how we would represent land cover in the UK. So all those are grid cells, and what the numbers correspond to there are the proportions of each grid cell that's occupied by grassland, crops, deciduous broadleaf trees, and evergreen needleleaf. So that's just, so in each grid cell, it's got a certain proportion of each of those 4 types, and that's what you use to drive your model. And your state space would contain those fractions as part of your description of the state, and those proportions will change over time, depending on what climate does and how you parameterize the models. Land cover matters, by the way, a lot. First of all, these are pictures of land cover by latitude bands. There's the latitudes along the bottom. It's mid-latitudes northwards. These are different sorts of land cover, and there are 3 types of cover: trees, herbaceous, and bare land, because that's what's produced by what's called the vegetation cover fraction from MODIS. And you'll see there are huge variations in the way these land cover inputs describe what's actually on the surface. And those make a difference. These different land cover descriptions can cause up to 30% variation in the net biome production. And that's the climate quantity. That's how much of a sink the land surface is. So that can change just by 30% by changing the land cover using various one of those is a model. There's an LPGM model in there, the first 4 observations. But land cover matters. Another place where land cover can help you, this is actually not land cover directly, but it's a way of refining the land cover. So you don't just give the type of vegetation, but in the case of forest, you say, how old is it? And if I know how old the forest is, I know something about growth rates, I know what that forest is going to do over the next decade, as I said this yesterday. So this is a simulation by the French Orchidea model, and on the left-hand side, they've taken account. They've not taken account of age. On the right-hand side, they have taken account of age, and this is the net ecosystem productivity, which again, they've not got disturbance in there. So this is the climate-relevant term. It's the net flux it's the net sink of France. Now, they call it assimilation. This is not assimilation in the sense of Amos. It's actually they've used the information in their calculations. So by adding more information, you can refine what the models do because they can just use that information. This is a completely different example. This is to do with estimating a parameter. So the previous ones were about the inputs, getting the state space right to drive. This one's about a parameter, and the parameter I'm going to talk about is the date of bud burst in the boreal zone for deciduous trees. Now, this matters because, again, I said it yesterday, that when a forest or a tree makes a decision about when to put the buds out, it affects how much carbon it can take up, but if it does it too early, it suffers the risk of another frost that kills it. So there's decisions to be made. Now, you're able to measure the date of bud burst using something called the normalized difference water index this was from the vegetation sensor in 2000, and that's a map of Siberia. In case you don't know where you are, that down there is Lake Baikal. And if you still don't know where you are, that's the largest single lake on the largest body of fresh water on the planet. It's down there. Okay, it's an amazing place. Now, what we want, let me just back up a second. What I've said is that in the models, every process has to be parameterized. So if we're going to predict, we can't say, if I want to predict 2050, I don't know the climate, I don't know the actual I can't observe the bud burst in 2050, so I've got to be able to say what day will the trees decide to let their leaves come out in 2050. So what you have is what's called the it's a two parameter spring warming model, and basically it's a very simple model. It says that you've got a threshold temperature T0, and you count the number of days above which, when you're above T0, and then so this should fill that. I don't know why I went wrong, didn't fill this graph. But so basically it's that area. When that area reaches a threshold, buds come out. And then then the tree gets on with it. It's the start of bud burst. And you see it's actually quite late in spring for the boreal zone. Now that sounds like a really simple model. But you can actually use the data to estimate those parameters. And what you find, and this is a comparison between what was observed and what was modeled for different latitudes. And you'll see you get a very good fit, actually, in the Barrow at 60 degree north. It starts to change as you go to lower latitudes because you need more parameters. This relies on having a very severe frost. If you don't have a very severe frost, you need at least 3 components in the model. This is a 2-parameter model. Whoops. Okay, so you get a very good fit around about 60 degrees latitude. When you get to 70 degrees north, there's not much vegetation up there anyway, and the fit breaks down anyway. It starts to break down, so it's not even meaningful, but it doesn't do badly. In terms of, again, this shows a plot against observations. This does astonishingly well, this simple 2-component model against data. And it matters a lot, because if you get, at the bottom, the punchline here is in, there, it's the top one there. That if you manage to, if a tree or a forest chooses to come out a day earlier and it isn't killed by frost, it'll make a 2.2% increase in its ability to take up carbon. This is a big gain if you're in the boreal zone, because you've only got 100 days, and you're going to be dying some of that. So 1 day matters for these boreal forests. So getting that number right in the models matters. And so being able to parameterize from space data is a really quite impressive thing for such a simple model. Okay, now this one is a different, so that was a parameter estimation. This one is a testing aspect. And what I'm showing you here is the spatial pattern of burn in the top. This is observed from the Global Fire Emissions Database. It's for the year 2001, and these are 3 models: Lund, Potsdam, Jena, Sheffield model, the US community land model, which goes into the US Earth system model. And what you'll see that in the observations, fire is a very spotty, distributed or dotted over the landscape event, whereas from the model, it's a very smooth thing. And it turns out that in the Sheffield model, we have quite a lot of activity down here, which sort of matches that. Oops, sorry. Now, this is 2004. And what you'll see, basically, is that the models don't do anything. Not very much, actually. You can't, in fact, by some miracle, the Sheffield model did much better at representing this lot. So that's nothing to do with the quality of the model. It's just, I think it's lucky. But you'll see that the actual description of the fire is completely different in the models than it is in the data. And this is brought out even more so when you look at these plots here. One's the green one's Sheffield. The blue one is CLM4, that's the US one. And the red is the LPJ model, and this is the observation. So what you see is the models don't even get close to representing what fire really does, because what they do is they spread fire smoothly across the landscape and through time, but it just doesn't do that at all. You get huge fire years. So in this sort of year, you can burn 10 times as much area as you do in years like this. And this is typical of the boreal zone. And you get different phasings for Canada and the US than you do for Siberia. Okay. Now, and you'll also, actually, I'm not going to talk about it, but this on the left-hand side is burnt air, on the right-hand side is emissions. There seem to be anomalies because the order of the models changes position, but it's too much to explain about that. However, it turns out there's a neat way to just make the fire models within these things produce that sort of that sporadic, spatially and temporally spiky behavior that you see in the data. And it's a very simple fix-up, just using basically the probability distributions. So even within a parameterized model, you can make it behave like the observations without doing too much work. So we published a paper on this 4 years ago, I think. Oh, the very last thing I'm going to talk about is I've come back to, this is much more what Amos was talking about. This is Dalek again, but Cardamom Dalek, which is a souped-up version. Work done in Edinburgh. They took that very simple generic model of flow, carbon flows through a system, and they parameterized it. And then they're using a Bayesian description of it. This is what Amos wrote down. So they work at each pixel. They've got a probability distribution of a given quantity x, given observations. It's related to the likelihood and the prior probability of x. And you put in various constraints here. So you put in the climate driver, you put in various information. This is Modius leaf area index. This is biomass from both the tropical biomass maps I showed you yesterday and the boreal ones, which I didn't show you. And they've put in soil information. And then they saw this in a data assimilation process, just the way that Amos is describing it. And when you do that, you're able to come up with an optimized way of relating your data to what the model gives you. And it's in that very simple structure. And this little structure there is exactly the one I showed you. There's the pools, and there's the soil fluxes. There's an extra pool here. So there are 4 pools because this includes both deciduous and coniferous trees. So they have to have an extra pool to allow the deciduous trees to kick off in spring. Because if there's no leaves, they can't do anything. So they've got to save a piece of carbon to get them started. That's called labile carbon, and that's the 4th pool. But that is the same structure as we showed later. And if you do that, you can produce what happens next. So they're calculating the monthly net ecosystem exchange. That's the climate. That's the flux to the atmosphere, not the pound production, which is the other way, over several years and and across the globe. So this is a data assimilation process, like Amos showed, driven by a small number of inputs within a very simple carbon model. The other thing that's important on there is you'll see the bottom left, and Amos also talked about this, is that this allows an uncertainty calculation. So because they've got a proper structure to describe uncertainty within the model, they're able to come up with a net ecosystem exchange uncertainty. And by the way, it says it's in preparation. That was published 2 years ago now. So I took this from they gave me this a couple of years ago, this demonstration. You can also do other things with this. There is, by the way, there's an improved version of this now, so I couldn't actually find the most recent slides I've got on this. But they also are able to calculate various other things from this model, and they get what's called emergent properties. So they start to get correlations between parameters in the models, which and tell you a lot about the internal dynamics of the model. But on here is shown just some of the things which you can get. So they get the median net ecosystem exchange, and there's the confidence interval. They get the GPP, the gross product, the photosynthesis, and its uncertainty. They get the seasonal variation in net ecosystem exchange for different, for the tropics it doesn't change very much, but at high latitude you get big changes. And this one's the carbon turnover time per day, so it's the turnover rate, it's the 1 over the residence time. And the top one is for roots, fine roots, so their turnover time is in the order of 1,000 days in this model. And this is for the biomass. Oh, sorry, this is soil organic matter. This is round about, whereas that's 1,000 days, this is 10,000 to 100,000 days. So whereas this is a few years, this is decades to centuries, which is what you'd expect, because soil in the carbon, if it's in the deep soil, soil isn't going to turn over very fast. So finally, and this is my final slide, is that there is at the moment a major effort to combine all these various strands into one overall structure that we can use to observe the global carbon cycle and model it and predict it. And in this, and this shows, again, it's a conceptual structure of how it will work, but these parts of this are being built. And what you'll see that this overall structure is it contains a lot of things, but it contains observations in the ocean. It contains observation, and these are in situ observations. It contains in situ observations on the land. It contains remote sensing of various quantities, and this isn't complete by any means. It contains ocean carbon model and terrestrial carbon model, and you'll see also there is a flux between them because carbon on the land flows into the ocean and provides essential nutrients on, for example, the coastal oceans. And then you would link it to the atmosphere through the sort of transport models that Julia's been talking about and the atmospheric inversion. And then you can link it to the remote sensing of CO2, and you've also got the same sort of model for CH4. And then finally, you can relate this to what you know about fossil fuels. So that is the structure. I said it's conceptual. It's more than conceptual. That's being built. Piece by piece, that is being built. And this is progressively going to be the way we will understand what the current state of the carbon cycle is and now what it's going to become. And that's it.
Any questions?
Oh,
no?
God. Oh, come on, say. Someone asked me a question. It upsets me if no one asks me any questions.
There must be someone who has a question. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering whether you thought there was still a place for parameter-driven models, or whether everything should be moving more towards the data assimilation models.
Okay, depends. The strength of data assimilation is that you're using data you've got now. The weakness of data assimilation is it won't tell you what's going to happen in 2 years' time, because you need data to drive it. You can, again, I'm not sure if Amos is going to talk about this, is you can use data assimilation to learn the parameters. You know, a predictive model has to be parameterized. Everything's got to be parameterized. Everything, except maybe the driving climate, and maybe not soil, because soil doesn't change very fast. Soil texture, soil carbon does change. And in that Dalek model, you can use the assimilation to get at the parameters. And on there, you'll see, on the top right there, there's optimized model parameters are part of the scheme. So this links into a predictive capability, but pure data assimilation with data now it's nowcasting, okay? But that's fine. I mean, if we can accurately say what carbon cycle is doing now, that's a pretty good achievement. If you can say where the fluxes are coming from, where the sources and sinks are, that politicians will be very happy about that, because that's often what they want to know. Because if you can say that, that the Amazon has turned from being a sink to a source, and there's a risk that will happen, then you've got a catastrophe on your hands, potential catastrophe. And some of the models say that's what will happen, which is also. Do you mind if I just say a little bit more about that? I mean, modelers have a huge responsibility to get things right or to report their uncertainties better. You saw yesterday that the scare story about the tropical forest becoming a methane source. I was in Edinburgh that day. I was talking to the group with John Grace, who's a very eminent ecologist. The phones went crazy, because the policy people were phoning up and saying, why we're wasting our time putting effort into sort of preserving the tropical forest? They're driving climate change. So a bad paper like that, with a big story, this has huge policy implications. It was wrong. Luckily, if it had been right, we wouldn't be trying to save the tropical forest for emissions. We'd be doing the opposite. And another example of that, there's a well-known paper, which I'm appalled that Nature published it. It was one model run that said that in the sort of calculation that was done here, that the Amazon was going to die within the next 50 years because of drought. So basically, it would cease to be of any value at all as a carbon sink. Now let's just think about that. I'm a Brazilian politician. These guys, who are very competent scientists and know what they're talking about, they've just told me that in 50 years, large parts of the Amazon are going to be dead. Right? Okay. It's dead. It's gone. So I'll clear it. Why shouldn't I clear it now? Take as much as I can out of it before I lose it, and then we gain. A, I think Nature should never ever have published it, and B, the modelers who said that should be ashamed of themselves that they allowed it to even put it into print. Because that isn't the story. There are certainly risks to the Amazon from drought, and we do expect some loss of the carbon sink from the Amazon as we get more drought and more fire. But to put in a scare story like that, I mean, if it was on the front cover of the Daily Mail in the UK, I'd understand it, but not a responsible journal like Nature. So a lot of what I've been talking about isn't just some abstract scientific discussion. There's enormous policy implications about many things I've shown you. They matter because people can and should be making decisions on the sort of information that we're trying to get a handle on. This is even though scientists are impartial, and we've got to be impartial, we don't make value judgments about what we report. Nonetheless, the sort of things we're doing carry implicit messages to politicians and policymakers, so one has to think very carefully about what you say. Okay.
Thank you.
Anyone else? This is the last chance to ask questions from Professor Quegan.
Yeah, I'm leaving in 15 minutes.
Exactly.
Sorry about this, but I would like to stay and chat, but I've got to be in Cardiff at 4:30. So.
Okay. So
I can just say one last thing. Actually, I've enjoyed being here. I wish I had more chance to chat to more of you, but I love these things. So I hope you have a good rest of the week and maybe see some of you again.
Actually, we have one last quick question.
Oh, yeah.
So, how uncertain is our knowledge about the global carbon cycle at all? If we see the models you showed us, so it's like, okay, it could be either way.
The prediction. Global carbon cycle. Well, no, like I say, it's a big box. And you can, if I just look at the outside of the box, so if we look in the atmosphere, we know what's going on in the atmosphere. we can measure CO2 and methane. So globally, we know the number. What we're very bad at, we don't know particularly well, is how to unpack it properly. We've got estimates. And with those estimates, land, ocean, we sort of get probably the right sort of values. If you then start to unpick it a little bit further and say, in the land, how much is land use, how much is uptake, then it gets harder. Then you say, which process is it that's doing that, that's affecting these things? Then it gets harder still. And when you say, well, tell me what it's going to look like in 20 years, then it gets much, much harder. Now, the real uncertainties are in that go forward 10 years, 20 years, because as you saw, those models go crazy after about 20, 40, 50. They just diverge, and they have radically different policy implications. So, but as I say, I think what I was trying to say, and I maybe didn't say it clearly, is that one of the major weaknesses of those models is, A, they were I think many of them are out of date. They're designed for a world with little data, and I think a world where there's lots of data, you should rethink your model. Also, sorry, there was another point. I'm trying to think what it was now. Yeah, okay. So there's something else I was going to say, but I can't remember what I was going to say. But you can't throw the models out because you've no way of understanding the system without a model. So it depends how you use it. You have to be able to combine lots of things together, as in this picture, to understand what's going on. But what you've got to work at is getting as much bits of it under control as you can. Oh, yes, I know what I meant to say. Is that, yes, the models, not only them, I think, in my view, the model's out of date, but also they've emphasized fluxes. But I tried to show you that stocks matter. And when you put that constraint in, so the more you can constrain the model, the more you can say it's either right or wrong. So you can at least start to weed out the really bad models. You may still have uncertainties in the ones which are left, or differences, but at least you've got rid of the rubbish. And there is some rubbish out there. Okay, and that's partly and that's the sort of, if you're involved in this, you can work on that sort of thing and say, well, we showed the fire model's terrible. Then fix the fire model. Just do it. It gives you something to do that helps you to make the model work. So the progress is upwards, but it's slow. And part of the difficulty is I don't think the observation people and the model people at the moment, it's a slow business of getting the modelers to believe data and to use data intelligently in their models. That's an uphill struggle, but we're getting there. So models are essential. Don't trust them too much. Try and make them better.
Thank you.
In your opinion, which of the decadal scale predictive models do you believe in? Do you believe that the land will become a source?
None of them. I use models all the time now. I'm a profound skeptic. They're not, you've only got to look at the differences between them. The only way you can answer that question is take them apart and look at the individual pieces and tell me and compare them with data of some form. I've got to actually do that quantitatively. I can't do it by an opinion. I know I might have huge respect for the quality of the guy who produced the model, the woman who produced the model, but that doesn't matter. Finally, as in science, in any science, the acid test is, does it fit the data? End of story.
What's your gut? So the kind of the hothouse model has been in the news a lot over the last few days, and that's concerned with things like the land and ocean becoming sources.
Yeah.
So is your gut feeling that there's truth in that and that the land might become a carbon source?
Well, you saw that slide I showed. I don't think so. I mean, some parts will, and some parts do already. The methane emissions in in the Arctic weren't expected, but they're there, and then this part of the Arctic's become a source rather than a sink.
Sorry, it was a difficult
What's my
question.
what is my gut feeling worth? It's worth nothing. Don't forget, it's data. If the question was, do I believe what those model predictions are saying? I would say no, because I would take them with a huge grain of salt. The one thing I do know for certain is whatever those models predict, it will be wrong. That's my absolute 100% prediction. I don't know which way it's wrong, but it's wrong.
Okay, thank you.
I think there's just... Yeah.
Hi, so we've heard a few opinions about nature in the past few weeks, which I found quite interesting. But what about the peer review process? Why is it that seemingly the peer review process is failing?
Well, Nature the editorial policy for Nature is interesting because they want to put interesting papers out there, things that actually make things happen. Now, the first paper that talked about the lands becoming a source launched about another 500 papers because people thought, oh, God almighty, this is terrible. Is this true? So many other people went off to re-examine that claim. And it's generated a huge amount of science. So you don't always get the best science from the right science. You get some of the best science from people going out on a limb and making and showing that something could happen, or even just getting it totally wrong. But then someone's letting go away and think about, well, is he right or is it wrong? Is that right? What do we do about it? And but that paper, the one I'm referring to, was literally, as near as damn it, it was what you do on the back of an envelope. It's an exponential curve this way and a curve which does that, and they cross at 2050. That's it. Oh, the land becomes a source. Okay. But we saw actually, I think it was yesterday, that assumes the Q10 model for soil respiration is right, and it doesn't plateau. Well, that's wrong. Okay? So, but then you've got to go away and think, well, is this model for soil respiration right? So it means you ask lots of questions. It's like the argument about the Gaia hypothesis for the Lovelock got pilloried for a long time because he made this. He didn't make the claim. He made the analogy that the Earth behaved like a single organism. The whole of the Earth is to be good for life, and Earth and life has manipulated the environment for the last 3.5 billion years to actually make sure that the planet's good for life. Now, real serious scientists, oh, that's ridiculous. This is you're back into mythology here, and even using the name Gaia was perhaps risky, but it's a good name. That's generated huge amounts of science, whether you believe it or don't believe it. So it allowed you to ask good questions. So though I was critical of Nature, I actually was more critical for the Amazon paper. That one I think was just an atrocious assumption. I think it was Nature. The paper about the land source, I think I can understand why they did that. So it's not the peer reviewer saying this is a really interesting paper. Let's go with it.
Thanks.
I think...